This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast. And today I am here with my friend Charles Lehman, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributor to City Journal, and also something of a podcaster himself. His podcast called Institutionalized, and I have been on that podcast, so I know a little bit about it. So check that out. Today we're going to be talking about a cheery subject with Charles. Subjects some of you know a little too much about, crime. So just for context, we have some crime in this country, even though some people will tell you we don't. And so I want to dig a little bit into some of the controversies relating to the statistics and whether we have a spike in crime or not, why people say we don't, and what the possible causes could be. This is social science. It's a complex issue and a topic that is also really fraught. And so there's a lot of ideology mixed in with attempting to understand the causal process behind something that's incredibly important, but also there is a lot of non-ideological controversy about the causes that go into the rise and fall of crime. If you are Gen X or older, you will have seen a massive, quote, natural experiment in the United States, which went through a crime wave that began in the late 1960s and continued into the early 1990s. As someone old enough to remember that crime wave, I will tell you, during that period, we just thought that's how things were always going to be. There was some sort of idyllic pre 1965 period that was different. And now we lived in the modern world. And, it's going to always look like the movie Joker, uh, in the cities, and you have to take certain precautions, et cetera, et cetera. And then things started changing in the 1990s and then into the 2000s, and cities became safe and gentrification happened and whatnot. Um, and now, over the last couple of years in the United States, for you non-Americans, things have changed a little bit. I will tell you, I'm from Oregon, city of Portland, Oregon. I think no one would doubt has been going through a crime wave. It's been going through a multiple-fold murder spike from a baseline that was pretty low. And Portland has some serious issues right now with urban decay and lack of growth compared to where it was 10 years ago when it was a charmed gentrifying city. So with that preamble, Charles, why don't you just introduce your interest in the topic and what you're all about in this particular area, because you're a player. Let's just put it that way. There are some arguments, and Manhattan Institute in particular is a player. Which is focused obviously on urban issues. So yeah, tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we at MI made our name. We ran since the late '70s, but first did a bunch of influential stuff in the '80s, but really sort of were known for a long time as the think tank for Rudy Giuliani's administration during his time in mayoralty of New York City in the 1990s. A lot of the guys affiliated with constant broken windows policing, a lot of those ideas come out of the Manhattan Institute. So we've always sort of been a center for tough on crime thought for thinking about how to address crime as an issue. I work now, as you mentioned, in MI. I'm sort of primarily, although not exclusively, affiliated with something called the Policing and Public Safety Initiative, which is our team for thinking about crime. how to reduce it, how policy can better address it, how you can make the criminal justice system more efficient, more effective. My personal interest, I came to MI. I used to be a journalist. I've always sort of straddled, like lots of people in DC policy world. I sort of straddled the space between writing and doing data analysis. I have native data analysis skills. I learned to code before I became a journo, and then that became useful enough that I decided to stop being a journo and now do what I do instead. But I think crime is interesting to me. Well, there's a lot. There are a lot of when I talk to people aspiring journalists, I sort of tell them, look, you have to like find the thing that you find interesting that nobody else is talking about. There's a lot of discussion of criminal justice reform. There's a lot of some dominant narratives about the problems of the criminal justice system, the race of the criminal justice system. Not a lot of attention, I think, has in the past decade been paid to, for reasons we get into, has been paid to crime per se as an issue. So there was just sort of a lot of fertile ground, a lot of low hanging fruit, to mix my metaphors. Um, Working on crime as an issue. But also I think crime is interesting to me as sort of the most straightforward case of studying antisocial behavior. Why do people behave in socially destructive ways? What are the efficient tools for controlling them? So much of policy is basically about dealing with situations where people are getting along, how we can have optimal outcomes. Crime is the management of what do we do when people don't want to get along, people don't want to follow the rules. And I think that's a unique set of problems that you don't come across in lots of other domains.
Yeah, I don't know, give a little historical context here. You're talking about antisocial behavior, and you mentioned the Giuliani administration. A lot of listeners younger, they associate Rudy Giuliani with different things than someone my age. In the 1980s, New York City was, it was an interesting cosmopolitan place, but it was also an adventure going there. When I was a little kid, you had to prepare for the squeegee men, all sorts of, I don't want to say massive dangers, but there was a lot of annoyances, headaches, and expectations that you better keep some cash on you if you go to certain parts of the city at certain times. Don't be surprised if you get mugged. These sorts of things, right? Rudy Giuliani shows up. He was elected, I think, in '92. Republican, liberal Republican, but it is what it is. And he really turned the city around, and he had a lot of um, positive, you know, goodwill from the people, because in the 1990s, the dangerous, dirty New York was transformed somewhat, and it laid the groundwork for the Bloomberg administration in the 2000s, which really corporatized and scaled up. I think what Giuliani had laid the foundations for. Now, there is some evidence, and I want to go into this, that there was just a decline in crime in general, and maybe policy only had an effect on the margins. And let's talk about lead a little bit at some point. But I just want to put that out there in terms of, Giuliani, the context of antisocial behavior. Many of us in the United States today are starting to talk about mental illness and the homeless problem, unhoused problem, whatever word you want to use. And, this is bracketed into antisocial behavior. I think a lot of this was actually much more pervasive in the 70s and 80s in urban areas,
Yep.
to the point where there
Yep.
was actually like really no discussion. It was just called living in a city, being screamed at by random people, and basically expectation that you would be shook down if you walk down the street. And so that's changed a lot. And so why don't you just unpack what you mean by antisocial behavior, and what we really care about in terms of things like broken windows and crime, besides say murder or some sort of felony, right?
Right. Well, so and there are a couple of components there. It's like the historical, the history to which you were alluding, and I think look, I'm 28. I was born actually in the peak year for violent crime in the United States, 1994. So I have only ever experienced crime in decline up until the past several years. Um, Similarly, most Americans under 40 have no meaningful memory of what crime is like during the crack era, what crime is like during the 70s. What you see in the data, and we'll talk about the historical experience, and we'll talk about sort of antisocial behavior generally. What you see in the data is through the 1960s, and you can sort of see a trough and then a peak early. We'll bracket that. crime across categories starts rising steadily. First in the 1960s up through the 1970s, sort of peaks in the early 1980s, goes down a little bit, rises back up again, and through the early 1990s, it sort of hits its the second peak, and then it plummets, like falls off a cliff, to a relative low point. I think it's something like the violent crime rate falls by 50% between 1994 and the the early 2010s, late 2000s. I'd have to go look up the statistics. And I think part of what you're seeing there, the phenomenal experience you're talking about there, is this urban crisis that has many different aspects, many different attributes. In the 1960s, large scale rioting becomes a major issue in cities across the United States, particularly on the West Coast. That's partially sort of the fallout of, or the harsher side of, the civil rights movement. A lot of that's racial rioting. We move towards deinstitutionalization. So you talk about the rise of homelessness, really in the 70s and 80s, as the institutions are emptied out as a function of federal policy and the deinstitutionalization movement. You see more and more homeless people on the streets. The organization of gang crime. I think sort of, in my view, a general rise in sort of cultural license of antisocial behavior. We are much less willing to say we should curb people's misconduct. There's also a pervasive sense of policy pessimism in this area. I think something people don't realize is that you go read studies prior to about 1990, mid 1990s, the early studies like Stephen Levitt writing in the 1990s. Everybody basically says cops don't control crime. Like there's no evidence that cops control crime. The reason for this is you look at the correlation between the number of cops and the number of crimes. It's a positive correlation, because as there's more crime, there's more cops. You can't disentangle the simultaneity because they don't have the methods for doing that yet. And so everybody's, very complicated models don't deal with the elementary statistical problem. It's like, oh, cops can't reduce crime. We have no tools. And the conception of policing is purely reactive. The job of a cop is to show up when somebody calls, take a report, cruise around in his cruiser, and investigate crimes. And they're doing badly at that. There are like 37 other factors I can get into there, but I think suffice to say what Razib is describing is accurate. What you were describing as accurate is this sort of multi-decade total social collapse in America's big cities, and a sort of giving over of public spaces to license. And this will get to the point of antisocial behavior. For me, the definitive image is Times Square today versus Times Square 30, 40 years ago. And Times Square was like, nickel pornography stores and like people getting beaten and harassed and hookers walking around. And they've like cleaned up Times Square today, where it's now this like civilian, the population and the tourists own Times Square in a way they didn't. I think like crime is a very broad spectrum. There are lots of different kinds of crimes. I think we can say a couple of things. One is that there are specific categories of crimes that vary from one another. So, loitering is different from homicide. Gang-involved crime is different from domestic violence. These entail different motives, different kinds of people. But a truism, or a well-established fact in criminology is that crime is highly concentrated in persons and it's highly concentrated in places. So on the one hand, we can say, look, many different people commit many different kinds of crimes. The overwhelming evidence is that a very small fraction of the population commits the majority of the crimes that are actually committed. Most serious offenders are not what we call specialists. They tend to be criminal generalists. This, by the way, is part of the justification for strategies like quality of life enforcement, is that the guy who is committing a petty who's smoking on the subway or rolling up a blunt in public, probably also has the same antisocial tendencies that lead him to think it's a good idea to shoot somebody in the head. Or you can arrest him on that, and then you run a warrant check, and you discover that he's in violation of his parole, or he has an open warrant, and so you can pick him up. So I think there's a very broad diversity of antisocial behavior, and how you cope with it at sort of different levels matters a lot from a policy perspective. But one of the overarching goals of the criminal justice system is, or at least ought to be, identifying that small proportion of the population that are serious, violent, repeat offenders, and, in my view, incapacitating them as efficiently as possible.
Yeah. So I think part of this is the ubiquitous, social science phenomenon of the Pareto principle, So, a majority of violent crime committed by a tiny minority of people. I think it's actually like extreme when it comes to something like homicide, which is an extreme crime. And when we're talking about crime, I like to look at homicide statistics because you can't fake a body. In the United States, we have pretty good tracking of individuals, so when they disappear, you can kind of figure that out. Other types of crimes, there can be some shenanigans going on with how you want to measure it and whatnot. Just to recap on the homicide rate, just for you guys who did not look it up, in the United States, it went from about 5 per 100,000 to 10 within a little over 10 years, from like the early 60s into the early 70s. And then, as Charles says, there's multiple peaks around that 10 up until the early 1990s, when it just started dropping linearly uh, until around 2000. And then there was another drop in the teens, a little below 5. So we got back to the early 1960s, and now there's a minor spike. I also want to say, as someone again who is old enough to remember, um, it is concentrated. If you lived in the suburbs, if you lived in a quote safe area, I do know that the statistics show there was still a little bit more crime than there was, or than there is during this era of relative safety. But it did not affect you. This was a concern for when you went to the city. And if people went to the city, they would be warned by their family and their friends, take care, don't go to this area, don't go to that area. So when we're talking about something like homicide, um, I'm actually not personally worried about being murdered because I live in a particular area of a city around a particular set of people. When we're having this discussion, we're talking about a small area or a small minority of the population in a small area of the city. Now, that does have negative externalities. It does have spillover effects on other people. You have to go around a certain area, you have to avoid certain things. But really, crime hits a minority of the population really, really hard. And over the last couple of years here in the United States, we have had a discussion about the increase of crime and how it's really not occurring. And, just to keep it in perspective, proportionally, it's not a trivial increase, but we're not back in the early 1990s yet. For homicide, we're more back in the mid 1990s, maybe mid to late 1990s. So I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is something like homicide affects a small proportion of the population. And I think that's one reason why we see some of the discourse, I don't want to say denialism, but kind of trying to paper it over, because this isn't something you see directly in your face, like, say, the homelessness crisis in West Coast cities. That's something everyone can see. No one's going to tell you, actually, there's no homeless people in San Francisco. So, what do you think about some of that, Charles?
Yeah. Well, so and I want to make 2 points. Point one is about point two is about the recent spike and what we should understand about it. Point one is that I think there's an important distinction between crime is concentrated in places, so most places are safe. Most places where crimes are concentrated safe, versus you don't live in those places because they're crime ridden, right? Like it's not like um, it is importantly most people are not exposed to crime because they pay a premium, like they pay higher rents so that they can avoid living on the block where there are shootings. It's a dynamic system. It's that the people who are most exposed to crime are the ones who cannot avoid, either for financial or for personal reasons, being in that context where crime is prevalent. And I think that matters from the perspective of how do we think about the concentration of crime affecting other people, right? You are affected by the concentration of crime. You're affected by the level of crime in the United States because you make decisions about where to live. It is baked into your rent. The market takes account of it. You were alluding earlier to living in the suburbs. You were alluding to crime in the city, but the fact that you lived in the suburbs was because there was crime in the city. If the cities were not full of crime, then you might have lived there. And in fact, this is one of the things that we're losing right now. This is flight out of major cities, particularly northeastern, northwestern, these cities that really leaned into defund the police. We'll get there in a second. Is partially a function of residents put a really high premium on safety. Some people think this is irrational. I don't. I think it's sort of a fact of life. People put a very high premium on not being exposed to the risk of interpersonal victimization. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And so people, particularly now that it's easy to get a job, to do a job remotely. I work remotely. You work remotely sometimes. I'm willing to pay to avoid being exposed to crime. And that hollows out the city, right? There's a vicious cycle where like the urban tax base gets destroyed because of crime, and so the crime gets worse because there's no funding for for policing and other public services. Anyway, so that's point one. Point two is so let's talk about the recent increase in crime. So basically, what we saw. Tell the rest of the story. Early to mid 1990s, crime peaks. It starts to decline dramatically through the early to mid 2000s. Around about the Great Recession, that decline plateaus, so at a much lower level. But the first derivative becomes zero, essentially. In 2015, 2016, we see sort of a minor spike specifically in homicides concentrated in a couple of cities. This is the much debated Ferguson effect. What explains that? We can talk about that if you want to. It goes back down. 2020, homicide rose 25 to 30%. I think it's 25%. I forget if it's 25 or 30%, but a dramatic increase. Is like we go from like, what is it? I had these numbers in front of me a minute ago. Yeah, we go from 16,000 homicides in 2019 to 22,000 homicides in 2020. So that's an extra 6,000 people dead. That's a lot of people. The same thing is true on a per capita basis. There are also measured increases across a number of major cities in shootings and also car thefts. And as I say, a shooting is just a homicide where you miss. Car thefts, I think there are a couple stories. Some of it is that basically cars were less well guarded because people were inside all the time because of COVID. And then the other component of this is that car theft is incidental to drive-by shootings. So some of the stories, people jacking cars so they can go shoot other people. What that tells me is that a lot of the crime increase in 2020 is driven by the small poise. It's a violence problem. It's a problem of the populations, which is to say, usually, the conventional terminology is people in gangs. Although gang is sort of not outmoded in the sense of like it's politically incorrect, but outmoded in the sense of like gang doesn't necessarily mean a formal organization anymore. It can just mean the guys on your block and you shoot at guys on other blocks because that's how your neighborhood works. But gang is a useful shorthand, so people in gangs who engage in cycles of violence and beefs, quote unquote. Notably, other classes of crime declined in 2020, although there's research, a friend at Pandare and Chalfin, and I think Master Massenkoff did research looking at basically activity-adjusted victimization rates for other kinds of crime and showed that your risk of being victimized went up if you went outside. People just went outside less, so total crime declined. 2021, we've seen in the aggregate, and by the way, we should talk about 2021 because the actual is we don't really know what happened in 2021. We just have some guesses because there was a huge incidental disaster in data reporting. But in the aggregate, it seems like property crimes mostly sort of mean reverted to where they were in 2020. Homicides have remained and shootings remain at their elevated level, probably up through 2022. Although again, we're just sort of guessing based on city level data at that point. But there are individual jurisdictions, many big jurisdictions that are seeing increases in shop. I've looked at data on shoplifting in big cities. It seems like that's been going up. You can look at jurisdictions like New York City, which is having a dramatic increase in a variety of property crimes. So there is evidence that the sort of lawlessness that was previously concentrated in violence was suppressed in some ways by the pandemic, is expanding at least in certain jurisdictions.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you made a lot of points there, and I think this is alluded to the multi-causality of this phenomenon, and how we have to track multiple variables. I want to say one thing that I think people forget in the United States sometimes. The average age in the U.S. in 1970 was 28. Today, the average age is a little over 38. And so I think when we think about something like violent crime, murder, and some of the people listening out there are subscribed to my Substack, razib.substack.com, and I did a post in I think it was spring of 2021, just on just trivial analysis of the crime stuff, because people that I knew were shocked that there was actually a spike in crime, which there was, but the way information is transmitted and framed, like people don't always know. And I pointed out there that yes, we are having a modest increase, but um, when you have people that are 10 years older, on average, with many, many fewer young men proportionally, uh, let's just say that it's a little surprising. And so you're seeing some potency in the criminogenic population, who tend to be young men from certain social, economic, and racial demographics in the United States. I'm talking about homicide in particular, homicide and violent crime. And so, we shouldn't just brush it off and say, well, it's only a 20 to 30% increase and not a twofold increase, because in 1970 we had a perfect storm demographically in terms of young men, and there was actually a crime spike or an increase in crime and social disorder broadly across the developed world, right, in the second half of the 1960s. And so I think these sorts of bigger variables we have to keep in mind. And then what Charles was talking about, he dropped the term defund the police and has mentioned police several times. I think outside of American context, maybe some of the listeners need to understand what he's talking about here in terms of criminal justice reform, policing, all of these social and policy issues that have been in the air for the last 20 years in the context of this massive drop in crime and now a slight bump in crime. Can you talk a little bit about that, Charles?
You mean about the past 20 years of the policy
Yeah,
context?
we're in
Yeah.
terms of we had low crime and people were saying, we have a lot of people in jail. We should let them out of jail. The crime's
So
low.
so America has the highest per capita incarceration rate, official per capita incarceration rate of any country on earth. Official because like the Chinese lie. They lie about everything. They probably lie about this one. It really depends on how you count and who you count. But look, we put a lot of people in prison in the United States. I think that for a long so crime declines precipitously between the mid 1990s and early to mid 2000s. A couple of factors conspire, I think, particularly in the mid to late 2000s, to really drive what we talk about as criminal justice reform. One is the observation that crime is going down. Another is the ascendancy of the Obama coalition, for whom criminal justice reform conveniently unites progressives and black voters because, as you alluded to, black people are disproportionately involved in the criminal justice system. Progressives don't like the criminal justice system. You put those two things together and you try to sell people. I mean, it's a little surprise that Barack Obama popularized the new Jim Crow as a text. That's about what you would expect. I think the other thing that's important to underline here is the fiscal austerity that's required by the Great Recession. State and local governments have less money, and so decarceration and a reduction in policing services starts to look really attractive because you don't have to spend so much. I have a report I've spent my past several months working on, and one of the things I dug up is that across 4 different measures, the number of police officers per capita peaks in about 2008, 2009, which has been declining ever since. So I think I think a conspiracy of forces results in sort of a popular push for quote unquote criminal justice reform. This is a bipartisan initiative, at least nominally. Um, Donald Trump passed a bill for Step Act, which is like allegedly one of his signature accomplishments, which was a federal criminal justice reform. And the message is we can safely reduce prison populations. There are a lot of people in prison. We can consider, and I think sort of at the more extreme edges, we can consider we want police reform, particularly after Ferguson protests in 2014. We want there to be fewer police involved, officer involved shootings. We want fewer, black men getting shot on camera. And we should try to reform the police to do that. Summer 2020, as I think basically everybody knows, George Floyd killed in Minneapolis. Results in sort of the radical wing of that movement taking the steering wheel and saying, actually, we want to defund the police. We think that prison abolition is good, police abolition is good. We need to transition to a model based largely on social services. I think you get 2 effects from that. Effect 1 is that is an actual effect on police and public safety spending. There's really not a huge amount of evidence. It mattered in individual cities. Individual cities did cut budgets, but like not in the aggregate. I think basically there's a huge quantity of free money. Like My conspiracy theory is that defund the police was largely an effort of the teachers unions because they thought there was going to be COVID austerity, and so they union actors involved in the larger activist left said, let's take money. We're going to have to fight for funds. Let's take money from the cops. And then there were huge quantities of federal funds sloshing around, so it just didn't matter so much. But the other effect is that basically anti-police rhetoric became an acceptable and encouraged, even more so than it was historically, among progressive local elected and federal and state elected leaders. And that's going to have a real effect on police proactivity. Let's go back to that point in the 1970s, 1980s. We believed that police were supposed to be reactive. If there was a contributor of policing to the crime decline in the 90s, I think there are two things. One is that we put 60, 70,000 new police officers on the street after 1994. It was an initiative of the Clinton administration. This is the 94 crime bill, Joe Biden's bill. And two is that we started to develop proactive policing, this idea that cops should actually be out there preventing crime, stopping and frisking people, walking the beat, being a visible deterrent, engaging with the community, community-based policing, problem-solving policing. All of these ideas are 30 years old, but they work. We have lots of evidence now that they work, that putting a cop in the community, having the cop be a proactive presence reduces crime. So I think it seems more likely that there's been a drawback of policing, particularly over the past 2 years, although really over the past 7 or 8. You can go look at surveys of police since post Ferguson, and they'll say, yeah, we think everybody hates us. We're not going to like put our necks on the line if, particularly if city leadership is going to throw us under the bus. And I think that's really, to the extent that policing contributes to the increase that we were talking about, that's the primary channel.
Yeah, just it's quote unquote controversial to say, but I think one of the things that we observed in the last couple of years is if a police kills, uh, you know, a young black male, like let's just put out the demographics there because that's the concern. The media will be all over it. Not good for the police officer individually. Not good for you know the unit, the police in that city, that department. But if young black males kill each other in urban areas, that's really not worth reporting. Seems like I think nobody can really disagree with the 20 to 30% homicide increase, but that's just not a big thing that was recorded. I mean, the reason that I wrote my Substack piece is it was reported a little bit in the New York Times, but it wasn't a big focus. And then, like a month and a half later, there was an agreement that yes, everyone should talk about it, and all of a sudden there were a bunch of reports on the crime increase, right? And so, in this particular context, incentives matter, as the economists would say. If you're a police officer making a middle class income, why would you put yourself on the line when the downside risk is that you are too aggressive? And in terms of what's happening within the community, you're not really going to, I don't know, get attacked in the same way for not doing something, so you won't do something. And also, I think that we need to mention just in the context of the police, they're having some serious issues with recruiting overall, but in particular in some cities, because police officers do not want to work in those cities. I think it was after 2016 and Trump won. There was a Saturday Night Live sketch show, so for the non-Americans, just comedy show, whatever. And they had a commercial called the Bubble, and it was basically where everyone could be liberal and everyone reads Ta-Nehisi Coates, and there's only electric cars and raw milk at the farmers market. And then they said, come in the bubble. It's just like Brooklyn. And they're like, and everything's super expensive. And then they mentioned, oh, and also, we don't really have any police. We couldn't get any of them to live here. And the point there is, there's a certain segment of the urban bourgeoisie that has fashionable, leftist, going back to radical chic in the 1960s, attitudes towards the police. And I think that those views, as you have indicated there, they've spread to the point where it's the center left. It's just the normie, moderate liberals now have kind of some sort of base level rhetorical anti-police stance, and I think that's just causing an issue on some level socially.
Yeah, I think I simultaneously think it's an important trend. I do think we tend to overemphasize the salience of it because we're both educated and so operate in educated circles where those ideas are more salient. It's worth underscoring that consistently, year after year after year, in Gallup polling, the police are the second or third most trusted institution in American society. Lots of people like the police. By the way, one of the funny things that you found in defund polling is that often it varied, but often white people were more likely than black people to say they supported defunding the police. It was overwhelmingly unpopular, right? Like, even at the height of defund, you could get like 30% of people to say, yeah, we should defund the police. Um, you can often, what you get is this sort of, and this is a point that I like to make more generally, is a lot of contemporary progressivism is really just sort of warmed over ideas from the 1970s. It's not even like 1960s thought. It's like like second wave radicalism, post civil rights act. Like, now we're really going to lean into it. Uh, Progressivism. And so, I think what you see in the space of policing is, and you go back and read the reports on the policing from the 1960s. You go back and read stuff about uh, prison reform in the 1970s. It's all the same rhetoric. They're trying to close Rikers Island, the major prison outside New York jail of New York City. Today they're trying to close it in the 1980s too. It's all the same stuff. Point being, yeah, I think within that milieu, reflexive performance of distaste for the police is pretty common. You don't necessarily say, well, I think that we should abolish the police. That's a pretty radical position. But you say, we should transfer funds from the police to the community, whatever that means. We should spend more on social services and education and solve the root causes of crime. As I observed yesterday on Twitter, aggregate government spending, we spend 4 times as much on health as we do on public safety. That's before you add in education. The idea that like the cops are a major draw of our money is, I think my total estimate is that 2.7% of all government funds go towards policing in the United States. The idea that the cops are a major draw on our purse is just false. But I think the root of this is this sort of like constant Rousseauian position of the left. This idea that society is repressive. The true causes of evil are not in the individual. We don't care about individual misconduct. What we care about is like the social origins of that misconduct. And if we want to stop misconduct, then we have to remediate those social origins rather than perpetuating them through force. It's a sense that we need a therapeutic state rather than one that keeps people safe from violence. And so I think particularly because they are unlikely to be affected by crime personally, that's a very popular view among a certain cadre for whom it would be nice if the world worked like that. It would be nice if they would like to move the world as such, and they can avoid the evidence that it is not.
Yeah, I think what you're alluding to here, root causes, which is just I don't want to say a buzzword because root causes are a real thing. Before we go back to the contemporary issues, I do want to talk a little bit about the root causes. I think it was like 15 years ago. Kevin Drum, I think then at Washington Monthly. I don't think he was at Mother and Jones yet. Old school blogger. He's been doing it for 20 years since you were in elementary school, and now he's an independent. Moderate liberal, but kind of the view that you can call fouls on your own side sometimes. And he talked about lead and its causal role in the crime spike, and the switch to unleaded gasoline and the decrease in crime. I'm not an expert in this area. The last research that I saw was some meta-analysis that showed that that's not most of the explanation, but it's some of the explanation. What's your take?
Yeah, and Kevin was engaged with that. There's been some back and forth. My colleague Robert Brogan has spent more time with this than I have. There's a lot. My read of lead crime research is there's lots of individual evidence that all else equal, lead exposure increases your tendency to commit crime, especially early childhood lead exposure. We, by the way, have done a lot of work on lead remediation in the United States. Like, we could do more, but like, we picked a lot of low hanging fruit, and yet somehow still crime keeps going up. Uh, I think that when you go from the individual level, which I'm persuaded that, ceteris paribus, being exposed to lead increases your tendency to commit crime later in life, to the macro level, there are lots of different analyses. So the meta-analysis that you're talking about shows 2 things. One is that it estimates I forget what the number is, but it's somewhere between 5 and 30%. I think it's about ballpark. 5 and 30% of the crime decline in the 1990s is attributed to decline in lead levels. It's, several hundred studies. But the other thing that's really telling to me in that study, they look at publication bias, where basically you look at the relation. The results of small studies versus big studies and how they spread, and it's very clear that there are lots and lots of missing small studies that aren't getting published because they find negative results in the to sort of summarize the funnel plot for your readers without showing it to them or explaining a funnel plot.
No.
Which
you,
is
you
like
want to explain a funnel plot, because I think the funnel plot illustrations, because this is a general. Yeah,
pretty
they're
useful.
pretty. I mean, it's like you can just look at it, and a normal person can understand what's going on. So, can you just talk about the p-value and the effect size and stuff like that?
Yeah, basically, you plot on a all of your studies. You get your like fundamental for each point is a study, and on your x-axis is your effect size, and the y-axis is essentially a measure of statistical power. I think these one of the standard error, whatever. And what you expect is this funnel shape as sample size gets bigger, as power gets bigger, your results should cluster closer and closer to the true value. One of the uses of this is that basically, if you see skew in your funnel plot, if the small studies all seem to go one way, and then the larger studies all sort of like filter up and up and up to a small effect, and this is what you see in the lead crime study. Then clearly there are studies missing on the other side. You'd expect if you by the law of large numbers, if you take a bunch of different random samples of small studies, you should expect them to be evenly distributed around the mean, which is the true value. So if there are a bunch of studies that aren't evenly distributed on the mean, it means that they're missing, which is evidence of publication bias. This is exactly what you see in the lead crime research. And to me, that's kind of damning the whole enterprise, because it's like, well, I excuse me, I read it as people would like this effect to be bigger than it is, because it means the dramatic increase in crime over the 60s, 70s, 80s is like a function of a lack of ecological concern. And we had this one weird trick. And this is like ultimately why I find lead crime not very persuasive. I'm sure it's a factor. But there were just too many other things that very clearly caused crime to go up and down in those periods. Like, we really did hire a lot more police officers in the 90s. That really did happen, and there's lots of good evidence that should have driven crime down. And so they're going, well, no, it's because of tetraethyl lead in the gasoline. So it requires me to assume that lots of factors that clearly also mass incarceration, just things that mechanically should have reduced the crime rate, didn't actually do that. Stretches my belief beyond plausibility.
Yeah, I think the one weird trick aspect that you mentioned, I definitely, with complex social phenomenon, you want to turn it into physics, because then you can engineer your way out of it. I think that's the way I would like to explain it. If it was lead, then the problem will solve itself, and in an almost like thermodynamic manner over time. But what we're seeing in the last couple of years is the policy seems to matter. The recent homicide spike does seem to be localized into certain demographics and cities. And I think many of us, and this is not an idea that's actually widely known socially, I've talked to people, the whole idea of depolicing. You kind of alluded to it, and we kind of talked around it, but we get, in terms of just police pulling back, talk about what that is, because that is really not an explicit policy in most places outside of, say, San Francisco, LA, Philly, a few cities. But I think it's happening more broadly. Can you talk about it?
Yeah. So based on some of this is based on data, some of this is based on my interviews with police officers. With varying levels of certainty. I think that as a phenomenon, what you're seeing is a reduction in activity, and B, three things. One is a reduction in activity. Two is a reduction in staffing levels, and three is a sorting of police officers. And I'll work back through that. What I mean by sorting police officers, I know lots of cops who have left big city beats to go to neighboring suburban departments, which are more peaceful, more quiet, have less crime, so they're preventing less crime per officer, but also the people want them there. So they are less efficacious in reducing aggregate national crime, but also they are in these big blue jurisdictions where the mayor hates them. And like that's a real problem because it means that, pre-existing police capacity is not focalized, is not where it needs to be. Um, in terms of force levels, so it seems likely, and again, so there are like three different measures you can use to determine the number of police officers in the United States, and none of them are reliable. By the way, and again, this gets back to the problems with data. We don't know how many police departments there are in the United States. We have a guess. We think it's about 18,000, but we're not sure. Policing is uniquely local. And when I say uniquely, I mean it's compared to many other many other developed countries in the United States. And so there's a lot we just don't know. That said, it seems like there was some, although probably small, decline in the total number of people in the policing profession in 2020 that masks large declines in some big cities, which I think is really important. But again, there's also this longer term decline since 2008, 2009, since the Great Recession. The number of police officers per capita have been steadily declining. So, by some measures, we are below where were in the mid 1990s, below where we were in the early 2000s, and that's a big problem in my view. But this goes back to, really, even if you have the same number of officers in the same places, what they do matters. Whether, there's a study that I really like. I think it's Houston. Is that Houston or Austin? I forget to look this up, by Street Weisberg, where she gets detailed information on. She's GPS units in police cars, and she gets detailed information on where cops are. When she looks at it, she says cops are usually on a beat unless they get an emergency call. So she can track. She has geotagged crime data, so she can look at where's crime on the beat, and she can say what happens to the crime rate on a given beat on average when a cop is called away to a different beat because of an emergency. And the answer is crime goes up dramatically, not because the cop is necessarily making more arrests, not because he's necessarily identifying more crimes, but simply because the presence of what's something called a capable guardian, a guy who is potentially going to cause you trouble, is an efficient deterrent. You combine that observation with the fact that you need a place needs to be a certain way. Crime, like it's concentrated in people's concentrated places. If you have capable guardians in quote unquote hot places, you usually don't get dramatic spillovers. Crime doesn't displace to other areas. Instead, you just like have a cop on the beat who's serving as a deterrent, and crime goes down pretty dramatically. But that means the cops have to be willing to be out walking around talking to people. They got to be willing to act as a deterrent. They got to be willing to stop people, and they're acting suspicious. They got to say, you need to move along. They're willing to question or frisk them if they have a weapon. SQF, stop, question, and frisk, extremely unpopular now. It's been unpopular for about 10 years. And, I think that there are arguments of doing SQF well versus doing it poorly. But the reality is it's one of the better tools we have for getting illegal guns off the street. And fewer legal guns on the street means fewer people getting shot, means fewer homicides. So, when we talk about declines in police, when we talk about police pullback, we're all starting to decline in proactivity, a willingness to be out there on the beat, to be engaged with the public, to be willing to stop suspicious people and potentially prevent crimes.
Yeah, so you mentioned guns. I think a lot of people outside the United States think that guns are the root of our violent crime problem. And I think the issue is here. I mean, obviously they exacerbate. I mean, they're the proximate cause, like literally the availability of guns in many of these urban areas where there is a lot of crime, and now also rural areas due to the drug crisis. But large parts of the United States are pretty low crime, right? Can you talk about the variance, just for, I mean, mostly international listeners, really, because I think a lot of international listeners, what they see on TV about America is mostly about the cities. They have maybe some stereotypes about the rural and suburban areas, but most Americans do not live in urban areas.
Yeah, so I think two things are true in general about guns and crime. One is that guns probably explain a significant portion of the variation of the variance between the American and other developed countries in terms of our rates of homicide. Simply because we have more deadly weapons. Guns are an efficient means for converting a fight into a deadly fight, unfortunately. The other fact is there are probably 400 million guns in the United States. Probably 40% of households own a gun, which, by the way, means most households own more than one gun. If you own a gun, you probably own multiple guns. The overwhelming majority of those millions, hundreds of millions of Americans who own guns who are not criminals. They will not use their guns in a violent crime. They probably use them in any crime. And so that's I think I think an important contradiction. On the one hand, it's almost certainly the case that having 200 million guns in the United States is a significant contributor to our homicide rate, and also that there are lots of people who own guns quite peaceably. They use them recreationally. They use them for pest control. They use them because the Second Amendment says that they can. It's a constitutional right. So when I think about gun policy as crime policy, often the question for me is, how do you stop criminals from getting guns? How do you stop people from getting hot guns that will be used to commit criminal activity, including but not limited to shooting at the ops, as it were? And I think that strategies for doing that often look very different from sort of general gun control. There were I don't have strong opinions on the gun control literature. I'm often kind of a squish on this stuff. I sort of think we should do what works and is within the bounds of the Second Amendment, but there's actually not a lot that works and is within the bounds of the Second Amendment. I've written about red flag laws, which are sort of where you take guns away from somebody because a court can have somebody deprived of their guns temporarily because they're thought to be a threat to themselves or to others. I think these probably work, but are dramatically underused, and we should use them more. But then there are lots of other sort of straightforward law enforcement solutions that weren't part of the gun control conversation. Stop, question, frisk is an efficient way to take guns off of the street. There are a lot of false negatives, false positives, but also you really do pick up guns. SQFing people, prosecuting criminal gun possession. Larry Krasner's, the progressive district attorney in Philadelphia, felony gun possession prosecutions declined dramatically. It's a huge problem. The Bronx Public Defenders, one of the major public defender organizations in New York City, signed on to Bruin, the most recent Second Amendment Supreme Court case, saying yes, this is a problem for our clients, that they aren't, that they're being too restricted. The clients are violent felons. That's an issue. The DC City Council is trying to reduce penalties for felony gun possession. It's crazy. No, being in possession of a gun while you're a felon is a crime. It's prosecuted aggressively. Such the third one, by the way, just to really anger your libertarian listeners, I'm sure you have some of those, is that a great tool for dealing with felon gun possession is civil asset forfeiture. You hear about like all of these scary cases where like the local PD sees people's, I don't know, $3 in cash, but actually the majority of federal civil asset forfeiture is taking guns from people. Because the cool thing with civil asset forfeiture is that in order to get your property back, the burden falls on the property owner to prove that it wasn't used in a crime. So if you take a gun from a felon, like he's not going to go after it. It's in a civil proceeding, but the standard of evidence is lower too. And like the worst case scenario is a guy doesn't have his gun anymore. Oh no. But mostly it's an efficient, effective way to take guns off the streets.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, and I don't want to like delve into it. In the 1990s, though, I do remember gun control was a massive discussion. It was very ideologically polarized, but this was also an issue where these cops, the police officers unions, were very pro gun control. So there was some cross pressures going on, because I'm not saying that police are conservative, but they're definitely not part of the progressive far left coalition, which was
I was I was talking to a professional. Sorry, very briefly. I was talking to a professional acquaintance the other day, and he was sort of talking about how how do you frame dealing with guns from a right wing perspective? And it's like, look, say that getting guns out of the hands of felons is supported by the cops and opposed by Larry Krasner, because it's true.
Yeah,
progressive DAs are the ones who don't want to prosecute this stuff.
Yeah. It's an interesting. We've been talking for a while now, and it's like we've just scratched the surface. I mean, there's just so many variables, and I've tried to focus on the United States and emphasize the United States because it's one country I lived in and we have data for, although maybe not the best, and crime is a live issue. But some of the things that we're talking about are more broadly applicable, even during the 2000s and the teens or the aughts, when the United States had low crime. There are some major issues that I've heard about from friends in Europe with street level crime, not murders, but robberies and whatnot that were starting to become pervasive. A lot had to do with antisocial elements and migration and all of these broader issues. We don't have time to get into that, but we are recording right now in Happy New Year, Charles, in 2023. And I think all of us would probably hope that what was happening in 2020, maybe a little earlier to 2022, was a short-term spike in aberration, and that maybe it's over. Chesa Boudin, the decarceration oriented DA or attorney in San Francisco, was voted out. There seems to be somewhat of a backlash in urban areas. In the 1970s and 80s, it took basically a generation, I think, for mostly Democratic politicians. In some places, Republicans were elected in Los Angeles and New York, but to kind of react to the popular unhappiness with being mugged and dealing with antisocial crime. I'm wondering if things are just faster now in terms of how things react. It seems that the left talking points really got pulled back by the Biden administration, although you still have people like Krasner in Philadelphia, like you said. But I'm just wondering if we can look forward to a return to more tough on crime rhetoric and actions, and this crime spike declining. I mean, what's your expectation?
Look, I think that I think there are conflicting signals. On the one hand, Chesapeake Boudin lost. On the other, it was recalled. On the other hand, adjacent Alameda County, which is Oakland, which is where all the violence actually happens in San Francisco. Like there aren't a lot of shootings in San Francisco. All the shootings happen in Oakland because that's where the gangs are. Just elected a quote unquote progressive prosecutor. Rick Caruso lost, who was running on there should be less homelessness and less crime in LA, lost the LA mayoral election. There are positive signs. I wrote a piece basically, there's all this polling before the election that said, well, actually, crime is a major priority, and it seems like at the end of the day, crime was a major priority, but voting for Democrats was a bigger priority. Saying sticking it to Trump back candidates responding to the Dobbs ruling was a bigger priority. The place where crime obviously helped was New York State. Lee Zeldin, the Republican nominee for governor, ran plausibly I think it's the closest a Republican has run not running for re-election since like the 1980s. I did this math at one point. And his candidacy was crime, and of course, New York just sent a bunch of Republicans to the House as well, largely because they're focused on crime. Look, I think that there are conflicting signals. Things are not as bad as they were in the 1970s and 1980s yet. They aren't. They haven't been that bad for that long. My hope is that crime. I'll talk about my hopes in a second, but I think what was needed then, what had to happen is that a coalition had to emerge of there were always conservatives agitating. There were always people who were saying crime is too high, we need to act aggressively. But they needed a coalition of moderates. They needed everyday people to say, this is a kitchen table issue. This is a thing that matters to me. It's sufficiently bad that I'm willing to vote on the basis of it. What do I think crime is going to do in this? Because crime is a product of lots of factors up to and including policy, but not exclusively policy. It seems like 2022 looks similar to 2020 and 2021 in homicide rates. It seems like there are some cities where disorder is starting to get worse than it was in 2019. It's all worse than 2020, but 2020 was uniquely good because of the whole nobody went outside thing. So it's an outlier. My bearish case for crime, my case for crime staying high, is that many of the underlying factors which have produced the increase, and here I mean not just depolicing, but the emptying out of jails and prisons, the slowdown of our courts, the general reduction in social control, both as an ideological matter, but also as a structural institutional matter, the shift to remote work and remote schooling, the continued contracting of the economy, all of those factors are sort of going to keep pushing crime up in the short run. They're going to keep reducing the control exercise or the small subset of the population commits the most violent crimes. My bullish case for crime getting better is, like, at the end of the structural factors are still pretty good for us. You alluded to demography earlier. Best estimates is about half of the crime wave in the 60s through the 90s is just the baby boomers aging into and out of crime. We are an older, grayer society. That means less crime. We also have way better surveillance tech. Like you're watched by cameras all the time. That means eventually clearance rates should maybe go up. maybe. More importantly, it means that we've got better deterrence. Although there's the evidence on whether or not security cameras actually deter crime is mixed. We're getting better at database policing. Like data informed policing is still in its infancy. It just is. Like there's so much that we don't know how to do. We're only effective big data criminology is like 20 years old, maybe at most. So there's I suspect a lot of innovation still left, a lot of low hanging fruit to be plucked there still. So that was an equivocal answer. I think my prediction is that in the next 5 years, crime will remain at an elevated level. I don't expect another crime wave of the scale of the 60s. That's because of the demographic and technological factors that I alluded to earlier. That's my prediction.
Well, as a bit of a prediction against interest right now, because if
Right.
there was a
My prediction is that things will continue to be bad, and so therefore people should continue to give my employer money so that we can fix them.
yeah, just bad enough, bad enough,
Yeah, exactly.
bad enough that the grants keep coming in, but not so bad that you can't enjoy that sweet city life. All right. So it's great talking to you, Charles. I hope the listeners learned something. And again, Charles, you are at City Journal, and you are a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and you have a podcast that I will link to with Aaron Sabarium, our mutual friend. And so it was great talking to you, and I will see you around.
Thanks for having me on.
This podcast for kids.